For centuries, Australia looked like a prize waiting to be claimed. Vast land, endless coastline, untapped wealth. But behind the maps and royal speeches, Britain saw something else entirely. A continent so isolated, hostile and unpredictable that many believed it could become the empire's greatest mistake. And the deeper Britain pushed into Australia, the more terrifying the future became. In 1788, the first fleet arrived at Sydney Cove after months trapped at sea. The British came expecting opportunity. What greeted them was brutal heat, strange wildlife, infertile soil, and complete uncertainty. Supplies rotted, crops failed, men collapsed from exhaustion. Some officers secretly feared the colony would starve before it survived a single year. But survival wasn't the only problem. Britain had dumped thousands of convicts onto a continent they barely understood. Murderers, thieves, political rebels, all trapped together at the edge of the known world. Tension spread through the camps like disease. Punishments became savage. Floggings, hangings, chains. The dream of a new colony quickly turned into a desperate prison, struggling to hold itself together. And then came the land itself. The Australian interior seemed endless.
Yet Britain kept pushing deeper. Why? Because rumours began spreading through London that Australia could become the Empire's greatest strategic weapon in the Pacific. Whoever controlled Australia could dominate trade routes, military access, and influence across half the globe. Suddenly, this failed prison colony became critically important. But there was one problem Britain underestimated from the very beginning: people already living there. For over 60,000 years, Indigenous Australians had survived in some of the harshest environments on Earth. They understood the land in ways British settlers never could. Water sources invisible to outsiders. Seasonal patterns hidden inside the landscape. Survival techniques developed over thousands of generations. And as British expansion accelerated, conflict exploded across the frontier. Entire settlements lived in fear of retaliation raids. Armed patrols moved through the bush at night. Smoke rose over isolated homesteads. Across decades of violence, massacres and reprisals scarred the frontier. Yet many of these conflicts were barely recorded by colonial authorities, buried beneath official reports that described the expansion as peaceful settlement.
Then came the gold rush. In the 1850s, news of gold transformed Australia almost overnight. Ships flooded the harbours, carrying fortune seekers from Europe, America and China. Cities exploded with growth. Melbourne became one of the richest cities in the world. But wealth brought instability. Crime surged. Armed gangs roamed rural roads. Miners rebelled against colonial authorities in violent uprisings like the Eureka Stockade, where anger against British control finally erupted into open resistance. And while Australia grew richer, Britain's fear shifted again. This time, the threat wasn't collapse from within.
it was invasion from outside. By the late 19th century, European powers and rising Asian empires were expanding aggressively across the Pacific. Newspapers warned Australians that foreign fleets could appear without warning on their shores. Coastal forts were built, military drills intensified. Panic spread through politicians who feared Australia was impossible to defend because of its sheer size and isolation. Then World War I arrived, and Australia was thrown into one of the bloodiest chapters in its history.
Thousands of Australian young soldiers sailed across the world, believing they were defending British Empire. At Gallipoli, they landed under relentless gunfire on steep cliffs and exposed beaches. Entire units were wiped out within hours. Survivors described the battlefield as a living nightmare of mud, flies, blood, and endless artillery fire. The campaign failed militarily, but it changed Australia forever. For the first time, many Australians began questioning whether loyalty to Britain was worth the cost. The empire that once promised protection had sent an entire generation into slaughter. And as global tensions escalated again during World War II, those fears became terrifyingly real. In 1942, Japanese aircraft bombed Darwin. Submarines entered Sydney Harbour. Suddenly, war was no longer happening somewhere distant. Australia itself had become vulnerable. British forces were stretched thin across Europe, and many Australians realised Britain could no longer guarantee their survival. That moment changed the country permanently. Australia began shifting away from dependence on Britain and toward a new alliance with the United States. Its identity started changing from isolated British colony to independent regional power. But the fear never completely disappeared. Even today, Australia remains a continent defined by distance, vulnerable supply lines, extreme environments, and growing geopolitical pressure across the Pacific. Because beneath the modern cities and beaches lies an uncomfortable truth few empires ever wanted to admit. Australia was never easy to control. It was too vast, too harsh, too unpredictable. And every generation that tried to shape it was eventually forced to confront the same reality. The continent always fights